Welcome to the Big Money Questions. I'm Rachel Rickard-Strauss, Personal Finance Editor for This Is Money. Today, big question. If we could afford to bail out the banks, creating money to bail out the banks, why can't we do the same now with the NHS? We are lucky enough to have Ann Pettifor here to explain it to us. She is Director of Prime Economics, and she's also the author of a new book, The Production of Money, How to Break the Power of the Banks. So Anne, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello. Good morning.
Let's go straight in.
Yeah.
If we could find the money to bail out banks, why aren't we doing the same thing with the NHS?
Well, I mean, that's a really important question, that, because what we don't understand is that money isn't notes and coins and or even your digital card that you use when you buy a coffee in the coffee shop. Money is a system. It's a socially constructed system. It's a man-made system. It's not like gravity. It's not nature. It's a man-made system, and it's a system whereby we make promises to each other. The very famous economist Joseph Schumpeter said, money is nothing more than the promise to pay. I promise to pay you if you promise to cut my hair, and so on and so forth. And so we have these promises and obligations and debts and credits, and we use these for us to engage in transactions, to do business, basically. And it's a wonderful system, but it has to be managed, because there's got to be a third party helping you and I. When I go into the coffee shop, I don't know you, and someone in the bank says, look, you can trust her card, because I've given her a card which says she's trustworthy, and therefore you will get paid for your cappuccino. So we need a third party to help us fulfill our obligations and our liabilities and assets. So that's how the system works. It works at a very high level with the central bank. The central bank has clients called banks. You and I can't have a bank account at the central bank, at the Federal Reserve or at the Bank of England. And the banks have an account with the Fed, and there are promises and obligations and assets and liabilities and credits and debts that go across there. Mm-hmm. And then there's the government, which also has liabilities and assets and so on. And then there's you and I and businesses and so on. So when the crisis happened and the banks needed to be bailed out, they went to see the bank manager, and he said, right, I'll give you an overdraft.
Their bank manager.
It's their bank manager.
For us, the Bank of
England. And I'll give you an overdraft. We call it QE. And what I'll do, but I need you to give me collateral, because I don't trust you entirely. So you give me your collateral. And the central banks were very generous. They were given some pretty rotten collateral, but they put them on the balance sheets and they gave the banks an overdraft, if you like. It's not money in that sense. And the banks went off, and that meant they could spend more because they had more space on their balance sheets, if you like. So that system, but the central banks were very generous to the banks. They got overdrafts the size of which you and I would never get, right?
On rubbish. On
rubbish, really. Yeah. You and I would have to put up the house as mortgage,
yeah.
But they put up some pretty lousy collateral. Anyway, the central banks did that in order to save the whole system, and thank God they did, or else you and I would have not been able to draw money from an ATM. So that was good. Then there's the government. Now, the government is probably the best customer in town, really. It's the best borrower. When you and I want to borrow money from the bank, we put up a mortgage or a property against a mortgage. We put up collateral. The government's got fabulous collateral. The government's got existing taxpayers. Sometimes something like 30 million of us Brits are taxpayers. And the wonderful thing is, a new taxpayer is born every day, and so they have taxpayers into the future. We know that in the next 30 years, the government's going to still have taxpayers. So when you lend money to the government, the collateral's rather fabulous, basically. So there is no reason why the government shouldn't issue a little chit a bond saying, I promise to pay you in the future, and you either private banks or the central bank lend money to the government against that collateral. And the wonderful thing about it isn't the exchange, It's that the government can then go and spend the money. And the good thing about government spending, when the private sector is frozen and terrified of spending because they've got too much debt already, or they've got their books in a mess, or they're corrupt, and the economy is flat, if you like, the government can go and build a bridge or a hospital or pay for nurses. And the great thing about government expenditure is that it pays for itself, because when you hire a nurse, she gets a job, she gets employment, and what does she do when she gets employment? She gets an income, but she also pays taxes, right? Whereas you and I don't have a system whereby, we can employ somebody and they'll pay us back in the form of taxes. The government has that. And so when the government spends, it can generate income to repay that debt. So as well as having taxpayers as collateral, they know that their spending generates income. Whereas my spending in the shops in the high street doesn't generate income for me, as my husband keeps pointing out to me. When I buy a handbag, that handbag comes into my pockets, into my house, but it doesn't generate an income. When the government employs a nurse, that generates income. Now, unfortunately, we're dominated by some very old-fashioned economists who have the notion that it's a very bad thing for the government to have any debt at all, to have any obligation either to the central bank or to private banks. But if there isn't an obligation, there can't be an asset. If there isn't a debt, there isn't a credit. And if there isn't credit and debt, there isn't money. And if there isn't money, there's no spending, there's no employment, and there's no income. So it's a bit backwards, and unfortunately governments take the advice of these very old-fashioned, out-of-date economists.
Can it go too far, though? Because that seems to be what a lot of the debate is about at the moment.
Yes.
That some people seem happy with the idea that the government would borrow, but the narrative is always about, well, we shouldn't spend beyond our means, we should fix the roof while the sun shines. We have to balance the books.
Yes.
So this idea that perhaps we can borrow a little, but we don't want things to go too far. And if we do, then we lose a little bit of our credibility internationally, because we're seen as spendthrifts who just borrow lots of money and are dependent on high levels of debt.
Yeah, that is the argument, Rachel. And it derives from economists looking at the microeconomy, i.e. your household or my household. We are the microeconomy, my household and my budget, and extrapolating from that to the macroeconomy. Now, the government's in the macroeconomy. The government's budget is very different from yours and my budget, mainly because the government has a central bank and because it has taxpayers. And of course, at some point, the government's books have to balance. But the government's books get out of balance not because the government spends too much, but because the economy collapses after a financial crisis caused by private bankers. People lose their jobs, businesses go bust, they don't pay taxes, and the budget deficit goes up. Now, to bring that down, you need businesses to become healthy, you need people to get jobs, and you need taxes to be paid. So the government's job is to create that economic activity, which normally they wouldn't have to do that. Normally the private sector makes sure that there's enough money circulating in the economy so that a business can have an overdraft and a corner shop can carry on. And I can have a job and pay my taxes. But when the private sector goes bust and has failed, as the banking system did, then the government has a duty to revive economic activity for the sake of the private sector. And when it does that, hey presto, it gets more income and boom, the budget comes down again.
So in a sense, to decrease this disparity, you've got two options. Either you bring down spending or you bring up economic activity,
exactly.
The amount of money that's going around in the economy.
Yes.
And by bringing this down, you might affect the size of the economy.
Yes. Now, what George Osborne did was he took the old-fashioned economist's advice and he cut government spending. That cut economic activity on the ground. Fewer people paid taxes, and the thing got worse. And his debt, I think the debt today is £85 billion, and George Osborne assured us that by 2017 the debt would have been paid off. So, so this is a bit like the government has cut off its source of income, and its source of income is a thriving private economic sector. But the thriving private economic sector couldn't thrive because the banks were all bust and weren't lending. You know, SMEs haven't been able to borrow money from the banks at an affordable rate. No. And instead, they've been lending money to the banks. They've been putting more money in the banks, the SMEs, and the banks have been lending it to the... That's bizarre. It's never happened before, and it's a symptom of how bad the financial crisis was. And at that moment, Gordon Brown as well, to an extent, but George Osborne made things a lot worse by depriving the economy of the oxygen of government spending, which would have then revived a lot of private companies. You know, when you're going to build a railway line, say HS2, it's not going to be built by government construction workers. It gets built by private construction workers. The construction company makes a lot of money out of it. It employs people, they make money, and both of them, the construction company pays capital gains tax or whatever it pays, corporation tax, and the private people pay their taxes. And the government gets the income from the taxation, but these private companies benefit from the infrastructure expenditure. And the same applies to the health service. Now, the health service is slightly different because it doesn't generate, you know, just like the railways will generate income from ticket sales, you don't get ticket sales at the NHS. What you do, though, is you employ nurses and other workers and doctors and surgeons, and the more people you employ, the more employment there is in the economy, the more taxes there are for the government. So that's what's advantageous about investing in the National Health Service. And to say that we don't have money for it is really dishonest of politicians. And there is another thing. I mean, we must talk about inflation and deflation at some point.
Why do we talk about it in those terms, though? That there's just not money in the pot to pay for basic services. Where does that idea come from then? Well, is it just a resistance to create more money by getting into more debt?
It's not. It's a failure to understand that the government's budget is very different from a private budget. That's all. And that failure is an economic failure. Is a failure of the economics profession. And my big gripe isn't with politicians. Well, to an extent, it's with politicians who've got this all wrong. My big gripe is with the economics profession, which has led us all to be... And then I remember Mrs. Thatcher saying, oh, there's no such money as state money. There's only taxpayers' money, and it's your money, and every time we spend, we'll take it out of your purse, you know. Now, that kind of language had a great impact on the public. But the public has seen what you and I have seen, which is that when it came to bailing out the private banks, suddenly it wasn't your money, because there was Ben Bernanke gave an amazing, first time ever a Federal Reserve governor has given an interview television, and the day before that he'd given AIG $85 billion to help bail out AIG. AIG should never have had an account with the Fed because it was an insurance company, not a bank. So the journalist says to him, now, Mr. Bernanke, where did you get that from? Is that taxpayers' money? And he says, no, it's not taxpayers' money. We have at the Federal Reserve something that every commercial bank has. It's called a computer. And we entered the numbers, $85 billion, and there's 11 digits in there. You'd have to count all your noughts, and it went straight into AIG's account. Of course, they had to offer collateral. Of course, they had to sign a contract promising to pay, and they'd go to jail if they didn't. And of course, they had to pay a rate of interest on that. But they got the money, you know. Now, that is what's so civilized about a monetary system. And that's why we should be proud of our monetary system, that it can do that in a crisis, really. I spent a lot of time working in poor countries where they don't have proper monetary systems, where they don't have the judicial system for upholding the contract, and they don't have a proper taxation system, and they don't have a proper accounting system. So they don't have a monetary system, so they don't have any money. It's as simple as that.
How far can it go, though? If we can just print money for the NHS, there are all sorts of other public services that we probably could do with a bit more funding for as well.
Yes.
Where does it end?
So the point is, my point is this, the system has to be managed, right? Because when a bank gives you an overdraft or gives you a credit card, they set terms and conditions, and they monetize your promises, if you like. You know, they make some money out of it. Now, I have no objection to them making some money and helping me pay for my coffee in the morning. But they can mismanage that. And so that, because it's a social construct, money, it has to be managed. If you let it get out of control, if the bank allows any old soul to have a credit card, even if they're drunk and they're lying in the gutter, then you know you're going to build up debts. And also, if you lend money to some crazed person who goes shopping on the high street and wastes all the money, that also creates problems. So we have to be very careful, because if the banks create too much money, if they give too many credit cards out, if you like, if they generate too much of that credit, they cause inflation. And inflation is too much money chasing too few goods and services. So we have to manage the system so that the banks don't do that. Mm-hmm. Equally, when the banks are in the trouble they're in at the moment and they don't lend money, we get deflation, which means that the money supply, the credit supply, shrinks. And then there's no money for SMEs, there's no money for creating jobs, people become unemployed, they don't go shopping, little businesses go bust, and you get deflation. And deflation is a terrible thing, because it also increases the cost. If your wage is falling, your incomes are falling, but your debt is rising like this, then, silently overnight when you're not looking, your debt gets more expensive, and that can be crippling. Mm-hmm. So the system, the monetary system, has to be managed. Unfortunately, economists have persuaded politicians that you don't need to manage the monetary system. You can leave it to the forces of nature. You can leave it to something called the invisible hand, and it'll all work out well. The banks won't lend crazy money because they'll be disciplined by the market. Well, it turns out the banks have lent something like 268% of global income. 268% of global income. And we know they'll never get paid back. Right now, and actually right now, the lending exceeds income by far more than it did before the crisis. So we're due for another crisis. And all the time the economists are saying, well, that's okay, because the market will sort this out. Well, the market doesn't. The market does what it did in 2007-9. It crashes the whole system, and a lot of people get hurt. A lot of businesses are destroyed. A lot of people are destroyed. People commit suicide. They get divorced. They go crazy. So you can't leave the monetary system to the laws of gravity or to the invisible hand. It has to be managed.
So we need more regulation about who can issue debt, the type of debt that can be issued, and how much.
Exactly. So the type of debt has to always be the kind of debt that will generate income. Mm-hmm. Okay. If it doesn't get to generate, if you give it to someone who, as I say, is lying in the gutter as an alcoholic and is nowhere going to do anything, that person should not get extra money. And so it's the quality of the lending as well as the quantity. Mm-hmm. And what we've been doing, what the banks are doing now, the problem is if you lend money to Joe Bloggs because he's invented a steam engine, or he's had this bright idea and he's invented a steam engine, there's no guarantee that the steam engine is going to generate income over 30 years or 100 years, right? So it's a risky investment, and banks don't want to make risky investment. But if someone else comes along and says, look, I'm going to take a gamble on whether or not derivatives are going to go up by 0.5% today, or whether or not the dollar is going to fall by 0.25%, and if I win my bet, I'm going to make a lot of money, the banks are far more willing to lend for speculation and gambling than they are for the hard graft investment in enterprise. Some private guy that's had a brilliant idea, but he needs money just to make it happen. That the banks are, mainly because they're bust, they're reluctant to lend for that kind of entrepreneurial risk activity. They'd much rather
the faster returns, even if the risk is higher.
Because you can make money from gambling far more quickly than you can from a new steam engine, or some other invention.
And we'll have to finish, but it sounds like, from what you're saying, we can find money to fund the NHS if that's what we decide to do. And it's not, as Thatcher said, that all the money that we spend has to come from our taxpayer pounds.
Exactly.
There is money available in the same way that there was when it was required by the banks, but it's just a matter of managing that system and make sure it's done prudently.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us, Anne, and thank you for joining us for the Big Money Questions.